Welcome everyone. It's great to have you here today. And today we're going to be talking about the weather and climate outlook heading into 2023 and how to manage and mitigate its risks. So I see the participants are coming in. It's great to see so many clients and familiar names dialing in today. Hope you're all well and healthy. And I really hope we have an engaging conversation today. I think we've all seen and know someone who's been impacted by natural catastrophe, and these events, they're increasing, and it's something we really need to anticipate and ultimately plan for. And so that's what we're going to hopefully be able to cover today. My name's Zane Beard. I'm from Marsh Advisory, the consulting and analytics arm of Marsh, and I'm speaking to you from Brisbane. I'd like to firstly take a time to really acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Turrbal people, of the Meanjin Nation, and the Yagara people. And I also acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, all elders past and present, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. So why are we here? Really, the Bureau of Meteorology has observed an increase in the severity of weather events and natural disasters as a result of climate change. And so now, with a third consecutive La Niña and tropical cyclone forecast for Australia, we can expect higher than average rainfall and heightened risk of widespread flooding on an already saturated East Coast. And so just for a bit of context, the last La Niña season caused major devastation across many communities in southeast Queensland and New South Wales, resulting in over $5.92 billion of combined insurance losses. And so that's actually was the costliest in Australia's history. And that these losses are not only been impacting property and business interruption, they're also causing huge disruptions in supply chains. And I'm sure many of you in your companies and in your day-to-day life has felt some of those impacts as well. Before we introduce the speakers today and get started, I wanted to start with a quick poll question to all those participating today, really to see how you're considering the impacts of climate change risk in your businesses. And so the first question is, would you consider your organization to have assets or operations exposed to natural catastrophe type risks? And so really, do you feel your business has got a flood risk, a bushfire risk, a cyclone, storm, hail, earthquake, etc.? So you might say very low exposure. So, you don't see that you have a financial impact, say, or an operational impact to your business from those risks, or you might have low, medium, high, very high, or not sure. So we just wanted to start off by getting a bit of an understanding of where you are. It's no right or wrong answer. It's just simply to understand from our audience where you see that. And so I'll just give you another few moments, and then we'll bring the results up. And so, okay, we'll have a look at the results now. We bring them up. And so, really interesting, over 60% of you consider yourself having high or very high exposure to natural catastrophe risk. And so I think that's obviously partly why you're on the call today, but I'm hoping we can really give some good intelligence on what's the weather doing, how's it changing, what do we forecast due to climate change, and more importantly, not just what is the risk, but how, what you can do about that risk and what some of your mitigation measures. And so thanks for showing those results. Moving on, I'm really delighted that we've got the Bureau of Meteorology on today. They've agreed to partner with Marsh for today's session, And so we think it's, to really understand the short and long-term impacts of how weather and climate, it may impact your business. It's really important that we have the right people here and share some of this. So we've seen, multiple insurers and reinsurers come out, for example, Swiss Re, saying that the natural catastrophe losses were 22% higher in the first half of 22 than the 10-year average. And so not just locally, but globally, we're seeing significant losses. And so having the right information on weather and climate, we see is essential. And so today, that's the purpose. As your risk advisor, Marsh, we want to make sure that you're fully aware of the weather and climate risks and the potential impacts it could have on insurance claims and risk management. And so joining us today is Dr. Lynette Betillo, who's a technical lead for climate risk at the Bureau. Joining Lynette is also Sophie, who is our ESG and climate change natural catastrophe leader for Marsh Advisory in the Pacific region. We also have Saskia, who's managing principal in our claim solutions practice and firsthand on the front lines, doing a lot of the major natural catastrophe claims across Marsh. And so some really good insights from Saskia as well. And I'm the head of strategy for Marsh Advisory in the Pacific region. And so team, it's great to have you all here. We're going to jump into Lynette's comments on the weather, but just before we do, we wanted to have one final poll come up, which if we could have that come up, which is not only, we in the first poll, we talked about how you're how you would rate your natural catastrophe exposure. Now we want to talk about how well prepared do you consider your organization in regards to not only understanding your exposure, but knowing what it is, but having a response and mitigation for that. Do you understand it? Have you quantified it? Have you got emergency management, crisis management, business continuity plans for those NatCat type risks? So not only do you have the risk, but are you prepared and know what those risks might be and what you're going to do to mitigate some of the damage and losses that might come from that? And so very low preparedness may be, you don't even perhaps know what those risks might be and how you're prepared. To very high preparedness would be you understand what those risks are, you've quantified the potential impacts to the business, you know how you might be able to mitigate some of the damage and losses and perhaps got some plans to invest in that. You've got business continuity plans and emergency management. So if the event does happen, you're resilient and know how to respond. So you're probably all somewhere on that spectrum, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong. It's just understanding where you might be at in that maturity journey. And so we'll just bring the results up today, if we can see those. And so even though 60% have high or very high exposure, we're seeing 50% of low and medium preparedness. But great to see 38% either being high or very high prepared. And so some interesting results today out of all those that participated in that. And so thanks for that. We really appreciate sharing that. And so we do have a question and answer function today in the Q&A box. If we are going to try to get some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have some questions throughout, please pop them into the Q&A. We are going to be sharing this presentation for all those that registered. There will be a link that you can go and go through it again, make sure that you have it, and you might be able to forward on to colleagues and so forth. And so again, incredibly excited and thankful that the Bureau are joining us today. And I'm now going to hand the time over to Dr. Lynette Betillo, who's going to brief us on La Niña and the summer ahead and climate change and how that might impact us in the short and longer term. Thanks, Lynette.
Thanks, Zane. Very happy to be here. So as Zane said, we are seeing that increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme events. But climate change, it's not that monotonic increase every year. Australia has one of the most highly variable climates on Earth. It's something that variability is something we have always had to deal with. And that variability is now happening on top of our changing climate, which is changing the peaks of that variability, those extremes that we're seeing. So one way, and I will talk more to those longer term trends at the end of this presentation, but one of the ways that we can manage that changing climate in the short term is by looking at the seasonal outlook, looking at what the conditions are in the season ahead to help manage for that changing climate variability. So that's what I'll talk to in the first instance. So firstly, taking a look at the recent climate conditions. And if we just go to the next slide, they've certainly been extreme. So this is for the April to October period, where Australia was the third highest on record for that period. And where we saw New South Wales and Victoria highest on record rainfall for that period. And if the numbers are being put together for spring. It's the first day of summer today, but Australia will likely be the second wettest spring on record, with New South Wales, Victoria, and the Murray-Darling Basin all having their wettest spring on record. So it really is. So that flooding that we're seeing, it is that result of that build-up of water, as we can see, but it's also a result of this really extreme rainfall that we have seen over the last recent months. And with that rainfall, we've seen cooler daytime temperatures, but really looking at that rainfall, if you can see in the eastern part of Australia there, that dark blue covering a lot of New South Wales, that is an area of highest on record, and that very much above average, which we see over much of the rest of the country, that is the highest 10% of such periods on record. And they're tucked away there, but I'll just draw your eye to that southwest corner of WA and Western Tasmania, which have seen drier or below average rainfall for the period. Next slide. And with all this rainfall, it's no surprise that we've seen an increase in the soil moisture. So the root zone soil moisture, that top 1%, that top 1 metre, sorry, has seen an increase compared to the standard period. So again, over large parts of eastern Australia, that darker blue this time, that top 10%, we can see over much of the eastern half of the country and parts of the northern part of Australia, though it has been the dry season there. So, but coming out of that now into that summer monsoon period. Now, just comparing that to the October 2020 in the bottom right-hand corner there, and October 2021, and we can see that we weren't seeing those really wet conditions like we have seen, we weren't seeing that build-up of moisture in the landscape like we have seen this year. So with the March floods, with a wetter winter in many areas, really having that rainfall on top of that really led to that extreme flooding that we have seen over large parts of eastern Australia. So with that third La Niña on record, it hasn't been a particularly strong La Niña, though we have seen record rainfall associated with it, but that build-up of water in the storages and in the soils as well really led to, or contributed to, that widespread flooding. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that those storage volumes in the right-hand side there, where those green dots are above or near or above 100%, and those darker blue dots are above 95%. So really across eastern parts of the country, really near full storages. And if you're looking at stream flow, likewise, stream flow really in that highest 10% or highest on record for many of those streams across the country there, except, as I pointed out earlier, with that southwest corner of WA, mainly dry conditions there. So if we go to the next slide. So what is driving this? What is driving these conditions that we've seen? So we really, the La Niña has been one of the main contributors to this. So it is the third La Niña in a row, and it remains active in the Pacific Ocean. We usually see a La Niña develop around winter, spring of one year, and then it usually dies out in around autumn of the following year. So it really is, once you get locked into that pattern, it does tend to last for a number of months. The La Niña that we saw over that 2020 to 2021 and that the 21 to 22 period, so that 21 to 22 La Niña really did last a lot longer than what is typical, and we did see the impacts from that. But it's not a switch in the Pacific. So when you do see that La Niña dying off, you can see that still that rainfall associated with it, with those warmer waters near Australia. And with the storages, with those full storages, with the soil moisture that we've got at the moment, it might not be it might not need as much rainfall to have that flooding. Because the landscape is saturated. We have the Indian Ocean dipole contributing as well, which is another driver towards wet conditions over Australia, the negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole, where you have warmer waters near Australia to the northwest there, and really influences that circulation to bring those warmer waters that bring that moisture and that circulation, allowing more rainfall to come through to that eastern and southeastern part of the country. Now, the Indian Ocean dipole, that usually dies off as we do see that Asian monsoon move into the southern hemisphere, and it usually dies off at around the start of summer, and we are seeing that now. It has weakened. So when we do have the La Niña and Indian Ocean dipole acting together, historically we have seen increased rainfall over Australia. And we've also got the southern annular mode, which has been contributing to these wet conditions. And just keeping in mind there those long-term trends. So the long-term trends so Australia's climate has warmed, and when we do have that rainfall, there's been a trend to a greater proportion of rainfall from that high intensity, short duration rainfall events, especially in Northern Australia. So just touching on the La Niña, looking at that dial there, we are in La Niña phase at the moment, but the models are saying it's likely to weaken as we go through summer into autumn. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just take a moment. So not all of you might have heard of La Niña, the Indian Ocean dipole, but you might not have heard as much about this positive southern annular mode, or this southern annular mode, which we're in the positive phase. So when we're in the positive phase, those weather systems, those wavy arrows, tend to be further south, and so it's a drier southwest WA and Western Tasmania, which we've seen, and we can see that onshore flow, those easterlies bringing that rainfall to the eastern part of Australia, so which we have seen. So basically there's been nothing putting the brakes on the rainfall this season. We've had all these wet drivers contributing to what has been a very wet period for Australia. And if we go to the next slide. So looking ahead to the long range forecasts, and with the next slide, we can see what sort of decisions are we making with that? So just it's similar to a weather forecast in that we use models, but of how those physical changes might happen. But with a long range forecast, we run a lot of models with a lot of different initial conditions, and see how that's tilting, see how those dice are weighted towards one side or the other. So with the La Niña weighting the dice towards wetter conditions, a lot of those model runs, the physical nature of those interactions tend to have wetter conditions over Australia. So we can give a probability of what those conditions might be. So we're not going to give an exact forecast of 22 millimetres tomorrow, but we give that probability, which you can then integrate into your planning. And if we go to the next slide, just noting here that that when we do have one of those stronger drivers in place, you do tend to have more confidence in the outlook. So you do tend to see the pattern of what the outlook looks like tends to be sustained. It doesn't tend to change from month to month. And you can also be more sure that it will go forward in that same pattern. And also that you might, if you've got a La Niña going on and you've got an outlook for wetter conditions over Australia, that past relationship can give you more confidence perhaps in that outlook. So, and I think would see an increase in that if we had the Indian Ocean dipole on this graph as well. So next slide. So looking at the outlooks over Australia for December to February. So what are the probabilities for rainfall? So we're looking, so on the right-hand side there, looking at rainfall. So those greener colours just give an indication of how many of those ensemble runs have gone towards wetter conditions. What are the chances of it being above median, above or below median? So we can see in eastern parts of Australia there's increased chances of above median rainfall, and in western parts of the country there's decreased chances of above median rainfall. So the models are swinging towards drier conditions there. If you do follow the Bureau of Meteorology outlooks, you will notice that that is actually a weaker signal than what we have seen in recent months. It's starting, that signal, which was covering much of eastern Australia, has started to weaken, and largely no strong swings towards above or below median rainfall in large parts of the country. Though I will say, as I said earlier, that it won't take as much rainfall to cause flooding with the landscape the way it is. And looking at temperatures, increased chances of warmer nights in the north and warmer days in the north and west. And next slide, please. And for January to March, just focusing again on rainfall, that signal again is weakening further. So as that La Niña starts to break down, that driver, we do see a weakening of that signal. And if we go to the next slide. This is one I'd like to talk to. So there's not much happening on here, but this is an interesting one in that this is not just looking at the chances of above and below median, which can give you that really good big picture of what's going on, but this is a new product that looks at that chance of unusually wet or unusually dry. So that top 20% of the historical range, or the bottom 20% of those dry conditions. So again, that we see a weakening signal here, whereas in the previous months that has covered much of eastern Australia for that top 20%. Now we can see some northern parts of Queensland and southern parts of Victoria. But so giving you a little bit more information for your planning there. So next slide, please. And this is just talking here to the bushfire outlook for summer, which was released from the Australian Fire Agency, AFAC, in collaboration with state and territory fire agencies on Tuesday, and supported by the Bureau of Meteorology, supported by information from the Bureau of Meteorology. So bushfires are always a risk for Australia in the southern summer, but I'll just go into this a little bit. So your eyes might be drawn to that big red patch in New South Wales there. So as with the flooding that we've seen, that really can cause an increase in that vegetation growth. So as we do go further into summer, and if we do see periods of hot, dry weather, that can dry out quite rapidly, and there can be a real increase in grass fire risk, which can have a really rapid onset and can really spread quite quickly. So increased risk there, and there's decreased risk in places that still haven't seen that recovery along the east coast from the devastating bushfires of 2019-20, and just highlighting southwest Western Australia there and Western Tasmania, where we saw those drier pockets, had those dry conditions, so already dry leading into summer, and we've already seen some fires spring up there in southwest WA. So next slide. And I'll just touch on that forecast that I spoke of. That top 20% came from a Forewarned is Forearmed project that the Bureau did, looking at how we can increase that decision making, that information that can be used for intelligence around the forecast. And just noting here that you can click on any place in Australia and get probability curves and information for your location. And just noting as well, I've shown the 3-month forecast, but we have forecasts for 1 week, 2 week, 1 month and 3 months. So everything beyond that weather forecast. So next slide. And so now I'll be talking about those trends in extremes. So if we go to the next slide. As Zane said at the start, we've really seen that increase in extreme events. So not just heat events, but record heat events, with the annual temperature being broken a number of times in recent periods. And we've seen droughts leading to bushfires. We've seen widespread flooding. So we're starting to see some of these extreme events that, that we saw in the projections, for the future climate. We're starting to see some of those now. So again, with climate change not necessarily causing this, but being that contributing factor, that extra heat and energy in the system can be a contributing factor to these events. So it's something that we're going to have to deal with going forward, not just an increase in the intensity, but an increase in the frequency is a really big one to think about going forward too. You can sort of plan for that big event, but what if that big event happens every 3 or 4 years? So if we go to the next slide. And there with that map of Australia is some of the projections that are likely to happen into the future, that models say are more likely to happen. And with a lot of these projections, we're actually already seeing some of those impacts now. So we're seeing some of those trends. So with some of those trends written down on the left-hand side there. So we've seen a warming of the country, and which has led to an increase in the frequency of extreme heat events. There's been an increase in extreme fire weather and the length of the fire season. Heavy rainfall events are becoming more intense, and a decrease in the number of tropical cyclones. So in the future, we are expected to see fewer tropical cyclones, but a greater proportion of high intensity. And that comes from the updated version of the State of the Climate Report, which was released last week. So I encourage you to go have a look at that further. So next slide, please. And just touching on another project that the Bureau has done in collaboration with CSIRO and the government's Future Drought Fund, looking at for agriculture, looking at that changing risk, and again, location-based, where you can click on your location and you can get an indication of how that's changed historically and what those projections are for your location. And that's an agricultural specific indices, including measure of growing season temperature, rainfall, extreme heat and frost. So that's a really another nice one to go and explore. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And I think that's the end, and I'll just say thank you. And I'll just draw your attention there to, if you want any more information, please do reach out to Ross Henry, who's one of the people at the Bureau that's really works directly with businesses to look at their climate risk. So, and there's some other resources listed there, which are going, you don't have to frantically write them down because they're going to appear on another slide later. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for that presentation, Lynette. I'm going to talk about in my next set of slides is the implications for business. So if we move to the next slide. So what we're going to talk about is what we can do about it, looking beyond insurance to risk management and strategies for the future, and aligning with natural catastrophe risk to insurance. So I'm going to talk about the first topic, and Saskia, my colleague, is going to cover off the second topic. So if we move to the next slide. So looking beyond insurance to risk management. So preparing for now, so am I exposed now and for the future? So as Lynette outlined with the climate outlook, consideration of compounding and cascading factors needs to be taken into account. This is also something that we need to consider when thinking about assessing natural hazard and climate change risk. When considering natural hazard and climate change risk, there are three pillars that should be considered. These are physical, transitional, and liability risk. Considering physical risk, this includes the increased risk of both the potential and frequency of property damage resulting in business interruption, but it also includes supply chain disruption to suppliers, but also the disruption to rail, road, marine, also your utility supply, but also the access of customers and employees. Operational disruption, do your assets become less reliable? Market disruption, and the value of assets at risk. So this may be due to either direct risk to your assets, but also within the region in which you operate. We also need to consider transitional risks. So transitional risks are defined as the risks associated with going to a low carbon economy, but importantly, also the risks associated with physical and liability shocks. Transitional risks can be broadly grouped into policy or regulatory change, reputational risk, market risks, and technology risks. So for example, when considering policy or regulatory change, we should think about the increased cost and complexity of doing business due to the introduction of policy or laws or other regulations designed to address physical or liability shocks due to natural hazard events and also climate change. An example of this is earlier in the year, the federal government temporarily changed shipping laws to increase shipping capacity of essential goods into Western Australia due to significant supply chain disruption resulting from the historic flooding across South Australia. And when we change laws and regulations, they can have intended and unintended consequences across multiple industries. Transition risks may also look like changing customer preferences and difficulty finding and retaining quality talent for industries and in particular regions. So myself, I've had first-hand experience dealing with clients in industries which are struggling to attract and retain talent due to climate and sustainability preferences. Declining appetite for investment in industries that not only contribute to climate change, but are also exposed to the impacts of climate change and are also poorly prepared. Restrictions of access to goods and services. So it was an interesting conversation the other day I was having with another colleague, and this is about the impact of leasing of commercial real estate, where some building owners are now not willing to lease to entities which have reputational issues relating to climate change or have a high climate footprint. When we consider liability risk, so for liability risk, it's important to look beyond the headlines of actions against companies being responsible for climate change. Liability risk may also arise from a failure to respond, mitigate, adapt or plan. We need to consider the increase in third-party damage or loss of life. For example, increased bushfire risk, both in terms of likelihood, duration, and also importantly, consequence, which may lead to an increased potential of significant bushfire liability. There may also be an increase of workers' compensation claims, for example, increase in heat-related injuries and illnesses. That also occurs on top of lost time due to the increase of severity and duration of heat waves. So next slide, please. So managing our natural catastrophe and climate change risk. So the journey to resilience. So we have a roadmap here. We consider the diagnostic. So the diagnostic is profiling and prioritising the risk. So which perils am I exposed to? Which properties? Which assets? Your supply chain? Are your customers exposed, leading to a market disruption? Are your employees exposed? Are your partners and suppliers? The wider community? Are your capital providers exposed either due to your exposure or to other exposures they hold? Are any of these strategic to your business? We then have to look at quantifying the risk. It's really important that we understand the risk and we quantify what the impact could be due to, say, for example, property damage and business interruption of utility, consideration of change of preference of customers, health and safety issues relating to people and customers and employees. And then once we understand what is our exposure, what is exposed, what is strategically important to us, what that looks like in terms of financial terms, we then look on implementing, building and acting on an action plan. So this is making sure that it's risk specific and that it is actionable and it's built to, and it's resilient, it's in terms of its design. We then can also look through the insurance pillar. So this is both using it to understand what we need to, want to, or can insure, and then also building recognition of risk and resilience improvements that we've implemented, and monitoring. So as changes in your risk profile and also the changes in the climate and our understanding of the climate improve, that we actually go back and make sure that our diagnostic and our quantification and our risk mitigation measures are still appropriate for the risk, and that we include all likely sources of risk and exposure. On to the next slide, please. So where can I start? So the first part to start is doing a gap analysis. What have I already done? What do I already understand about my risk exposure? What mitigation do I have in place? Is there anything else that I need to know? What can I use as a platform to improve my understanding of my risk exposure? Then moving on to quantifying your physical, transitional, and liability risks. So this is quantifying what the financial exposure may be, and both in terms of the physical damage, but also the financial impact in terms of business interruption or liability interruption or increased costs of operation. And then building out your climate resilience roadmap. So one of the things that is really important when we have this analysis and we have data relating to climate change or natural catastrophe impacts and what they might mean is making sure that we understand what this report means. So what does it mean to us and how do we use it to make decisions? So once we understand the report and what the data means and how to use it, building a resilience roadmap and KPIs. So how can I improve and how can I attach KPIs to the analysis that I have done so that I can show on an ongoing basis how I've improved my resilience to natural hazard or climate change. And the last step, as stated above, is monitor. So going back and making sure that our risk profile hasn't changed and that our resilience roadmap is still appropriate for the risk exposure. So on to the next slide. So that's where I leave you, and I'll pass you off to Saskia, who will talk about aligning natural catastrophe risk to insurance program design.
Thanks very much, Sophie. I'm Saskia Nichols from the Marsh Claims Solution Practice, and today I'm just going to run you through some of the steps you can take to align your natural catastrophe risk to insurance. I'll also share some information on recent claims trends for you to consider when thinking about your risk profile. And lastly, some key tips on how to manage a claim should that occur to you. Firstly, here we talk about an example of how a business might apply the roadmap that Sophie's just talked about to understand the insurable risk profile. This will assist you in identifying what you want to insure, and you can take a 3-step approach to review this. Firstly, you need to understand what your financial risks are. Do they come from exposure to your own property, or maybe from third-party exposures? Once these are identified, you should consider the controls you have in place or would like to implement to mitigate those risks, and what the impact of that mitigation might be. This will give you a list of potential financial risk scenarios to consider. The next step is understanding the full impact of the potential scenarios identified. Often we hear people say, when assessing their financial exposure, oh, our biggest value property location is X, and that would be the biggest loss. However, we want you to think beyond this. A financial exposure can be caused by other impacts, and it can be significant. For example, we're talking about the inability of a supplier to provide a critical component part for manufacturing. being unable to transport product to port for sale to the export market, or loss or restriction of access to power, water, gas, and the like. There are many, many scenarios to be considered. Once you've got your list of scenarios and the ones you think might have the biggest financial impact, you should work to understand what the financial risk and potential exposures are from these scenarios. You also need to consider your risk appetite. What loss would you be prepared to retain within the business? If my business is interrupted, how long do I want coverage for something like loss of income? Is there capacity in the insurance market to cover the key risks I have identified? Alignment with insurers needs to be considered, as they will have their own position on specific coverages, dependent often on current market conditions and future forecasts, which consider things such as the weather. Next slide, please. So let's talk through how your business might look to align a financial risk identified with a property and business interruption insurance policy. There are three key pillars of the insurance program that need to be considered. The policy structure. What are the risks to be covered under the property damage and business interruption sections? Where are those risks located? Is it just Australia, or do you need overseas coverage locations? Did you identify a need for contingent business interruption in your analysis? For example, do you need some cover for your customers and suppliers suffering damage? Make sure these risks are aligned with the coverage. The second pillar is the policy wording. What's the right type of cover for your business? For property damage, do you want reinstatement or indemnity value? For business interruption, do you need gross revenue or gross profit cover? Have you considered whether any of the standard exclusions could impact the risk you have identified? For example, a flood exclusion, a standing timber exclusion, or a roads, railways, and bridges exclusion. Lastly, we look at the policy declared values and limits. You need to get these right, and they should be aligned with the policy coverage you have selected. The modelling you complete as part of the roadmap can help you establish what the values you need for the financial risk exposures. Please be careful to ensure you consider the impact of inflation and other variables such as growth, as we are seeing co-insurance clauses being added into policies which can reduce a claim if values have been underdeclared. It's important to address the three pillars, otherwise coverage in a claim situation can be limited or insufficient. And we've seen this in recent claims for flood, where the coverage was inadequate, either because the risk was not identified, it was either not appropriately quantified, or potentially there was lack of market capacity to insure the risk appropriately, and alternative risk transfer options had not been implemented. Next slide, please. Some of the recent claims we've seen have been sitting specifically in the contingent business interruption claim space. And this is an observation that Allianz have recently reported, with contingent BI claims increasing in number year on year for the past 5 years. This is coupled with the average value of BI claims increasing across the same period. As the world continues to be more and more connected, businesses are finding their financial risk exposures can be significantly driven by factors outside of their direct control. Unlike traditional business interruption, which is generally triggered by damage to your property, contingent business interruption can be triggered by damage to third-party property, which your business relies on. This might mean you or your customers are prevented from accessing your premises. Your supplier has a fire and can't provide you with a key raw material. Or a bushfire damages utilities infrastructure, cutting power to your business operations. Contingent BI coverage can be tricky. It relies on your business having aligned your policy coverage, the three pillars we mentioned earlier, with the risk exposure that may exist to a third party. And that damage can then impact your business financial risk. Some of the common contingent business interruption coverages available include prevention of access, isolation by landslide or flood, customers, suppliers, and utilities. And each of these coverages can have different triggers and limitations. A couple of examples that we've seen. Prevention of access often has a radius or distance limit applied, and damage may be excluded for things like roads, railways, or bridges. There are also standard exclusions for commercial crops or standing timber, and this might mean that damage at the supplier's extension gets excluded. Other matters that will also require consideration include the event definition. I often reference back to the what we called the Queensland floods in 2011, when the floods started up in Queensland and made their way all the way down to Victoria over a period of 4 weeks. There were multiple events triggered for clients who had operations across all of Australia. Declared values need to be correct, otherwise co-insurance can apply, which serves to reduce your claim. And also, do we have adequate limits for the loss exposure if it is triggered? Often contingent BI limits are quite small and can be limited. So I'm going to run you through a real life and significant example of the contingent BI in action, which occurred in January this year. Next slide, please. There was significant rainfall across the Northern Territory and South Australia. And in parts of South Australia, rain in excess of 200 millimetres was recorded, which caused flash flooding. That flash flooding washed out multiple locations along the railway, which operates between the east and the west coasts of Australia. There was also some flooding over the main highway between South Australia and the Northern Territory. Aside from the rail and road damage, there was actually limited damage to physical property. However, the overall impact to businesses across Australia was significant. The railway closed for around 3 weeks, and as it was the main supply route between east and west, there was a massive supply chain impact. Businesses had to find alternative ways to move their goods. Demand for trucks increased, causing truck availability issues and an increase in the cost of hire for trucks. There was a general imbalance in the logistics network, with more trucks now travelling between east and west. We had availability issues flow to the east coast. Prior to the washout, around 80% of all freight travelling on land arrived in Western Australia by the rail. And how did we deal with this? We had to have intervention from government. So the South Australian government declared a major emergency, which allowed them to address heavy vehicle movements and food security for remote communities. And as Sophie mentioned before, the federal government temporarily changed shipping laws to allow access to spare capacity to move essential goods into WA. Multiple industries were affected. The key impacts to business included significant increased costs of operations, loss of sales where goods could not be moved, and longer than expected recovery due to the speed restrictions and container backlog issues. For our clients, successful claims had to rely on contingent business interruption extensions being triggered and sufficient limits, including annual aggregates, being in place. What we observed was many businesses had a loss, but not everyone had a claim. Next slide, please. So lastly, as we heard from Lynette earlier, the State of the Climate report finds that Australia will continue to see an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Unfortunately, this means that many of us will be impacted by direct or third-party damage, which results in an insurance claim. To assist here, I've summarised some top tips to help you in the event that you do have to deal with a claim. Firstly, and most importantly, understand the coverage you have purchased and be ready to implement the mitigation strategies you've considered. Be aware of the impacts of current inflationary environment, including rising construction costs and continuing supply chain disruptions due in part to COVID, but also just increased extreme weather events. Where possible and safe to do so, capture photos, videos, and other records of the event as they unfold. This can assist later in determining the cause of damage. In the event you do suffer damage, don't categorise the cause of the loss before you have considered all of the available evidence. Your policy coverage may differ depending on the cause, and we commonly see perils such as flood, storm, or hail treated differently in respect of available limits and applicable deductibles. Some clients have found having a nominated loss adjuster on the policy can assist them in expediting the claims process. Loss adjusters can help to access resources which can be scarce in large natural catastrophe weather events. For example, hygienists, structural engineers, quantity surveyors, and builders. And internally, in your business, what do you do? Well, have a dedicated person or team to deal with the claim. Implement a record-keeping process to quarantine costs relating to the claim and collate supporting documentation. Meet regularly with the loss adjuster and/or insurer to understand their position and what you can do to ensure smooth progression of your claim. And finally, seek advice early from your advisors. They're there to support you. Depending on the complexity of your claim, your broker, a claims advocate, or a claims preparer can all provide you with claims support to allow you to focus on returning to normal business operations. Thank you very much for your time today, and I'll now hand over to Zane to discuss the key takeaways before we head into the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Saskia, and thanks so much, everyone, for attending, and for all those that have been on the panel today. And so some really good insights that we've had, and a great high-level overview of the situation. And it's been really thought-provoking. We've had a lot of questions come in too. And before we finish up with some Q&A, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to use that Q&A function. We'd love to hear them. We've already had a few come through on the chat that we've been able to answer. But really, if we were to summarize, and there's been a lot of information today, we understand that, but if we were to summarize it in 4 key points, the extreme weather events, they're rapidly increasing. The climate change is real, and it's upon us now. We're having the costliest years on records for natural disasters. It's not just an insurance issue, it's a resilience issue for your business, and for your daily life. It's impacts across so many ways. And so they are there where it is recordable. We've seen it, and it's going to continue to increase in the future. You really need to take some time to understand what your risks to the business might be, and how it might impact, firstly, your properties, business operations, supply chain, all those things that Sophie talked about. Now, if you don't know where to start, and if you haven't been on that journey, or you're halfway through, we have a natural catastrophe and business interruption team and climate team that work with a lot of our clients on doing just that, identifying, quantifying your risks, helping you understand how you can manage them. Really, once you know your risk, and we always talk risk before insurance, you want to know what your risk is to align it to your insurance policy. We've seen a lot of pressure on natural catastrophe sublimits in your insurance policy, and impacting your limits as well, just overall, exclusions and so forth. You want to know what that risk is. You want to know what it is, quantify it, make sure that your insurance policy coverage is adequate and responds to how you need. And we shared a bit of a tricky experience there from a clients who have a very large contingent business interruption exposure due to a rail flood out event. And so you've got to look beyond just yourself to some of those contingent exposures when you're designing your insurance policy, and looking beyond insurance. How do you keep ahead of that climate risk by investing in mitigation? Where we've done a lot of work recently with some of our clients is looking at the cost benefit of physical risk mitigation, flood walls, and other areas that you can increase your resilience of your actual assets. So perhaps you may be able to buy less insurance, or just mitigate a lot of that risk that you have. And so looking at those tools across resilience, whether it's trying to prevent the amount of damage, or just increasing how fast you can respond when that event happens, and making sure that your business can have good continuity. And so that's really the four things that we want to make sure that you take away and really consider. So we've got some really good questions come through here. The first one is, with so many climate impacts becoming more extreme and historic, how can businesses plan for certain risks they can't even fathom? And then in extension to that, how is the insurance industry adapting to this increasingly unstable world? And what are the biggest barriers, opportunities in future for insurers? And so great question. I'll have Sophie add some points on this one as well. But we've firstly, the models that are used to quantify natural catastrophe risk at locations and for types of buildings and their construction are updated regularly, and having to be updated much more regularly so that the events that are happening now are being considered in the models. But there is a part where you just simply do not know everything that's going to happen. And that's where I would say, and Sophie's got a better feel on this, is we've seen a move towards not just the traditional risk management approach, which is you're trying to understand frequency and severity and then control the risk, to anticipating the risk, anticipating these events, and then become increasing your resilience, so if they do happen, what you do about it. So it's less about controlling and more about resilience and being prepared for the unexpected, because these, like you say, and that rhetoric and that question is around that. How does the insurance industry adapt? Naturally, there's premium increases, withdrawal capacity from highly natural catastrophe exposed zones. We've seen a lot of push for putting it back on clients to really understand what their risk is for natural catastrophe and what they're doing about it, how they're being prepared from a mitigation and resilience point of view. But that volatility makes it very difficult for the insurers as they're trying to grapple with this as well. But Sophie, anything you would add?
I would make sure to understand your risk profile is to use a systematic approach, such as a roadmap, and making sure, first off, you understand what your gaps are in understanding your business. So if there are gaps in understanding your risk and exposure, and it may sound kind of silly because you might be thinking to yourself, who doesn't know that? But going through and understanding gaps, such as, where are my assets? Do I have the right location of my assets? It's amazing the number of clients I've dealt with who have incorrect addresses or incorrect asset locations within their asset schedule. And this is going back to really basic stuff and understanding, what data do I have? Is the data accurate? Do I know about my supply chain? Do I know who my customers are and where they come from? Do I know who my main suppliers are? Do I have a list of critical spares? And if I run out of critical spares, how long it will take me to get another spare? Could my key suppliers or customers be impacted by the same event or by an event which I'm not impacted by? So setting out and understanding a gap analysis to understand where you are and where to go to from there. So that's how I would first start it. And the other important thing is, when we talk about can't fathom, this is sometimes when people or entities get caught up by not considering cumulative or cascading risks. So where we might be just purely thinking about, okay, what is the property damage? But we might also need to think about, okay, we have property damage, we have business interruption, we have liability risk. We might also have health and safety risk issues associated with this. We might also have environmental risk issues if this event was to happen. Could we have a pollution event because of our property or our businesses as they operate under, if this event was to occur? So this is when we see only a very narrow band of risk is being considered, but in actual fact, what we need to do is we need to understand what are the potential gaps in our understanding of that risk, and ensuring that we cover off all areas of our business that could be exposed to that risk.
Great answer. One other question that's come in is, how do we get the attention of executives and board to invest on mitigating weather and climate risks? Sophie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. This is going to hit your balance sheet, right? Whether or not you get a direct physical impact or whether or not there's a market impact, So this is where we talk about the cost of natural hazards or climate change. They are indirectly going to impact you whether or not your assets are directly impacted through the increased cost of products, the lack of supply. They are going to hit your balance sheet. So that is one of the ways to elevate it. The other part is the direct risk to the executives themselves through inability of action and failure to act, and the potential of exposure to litigation and loss of shareholder or class action via shareholders. So we had actually already seen that happen with major industries in Australia, where there is shareholder class action against major entities within Australia because of the way that they're acting under either climate change or ESG metrics.
Great, Sophie, and yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Helping them understand the financial exposure, their legal responsibilities and liabilities from that, and then setting an action plan to go away and look at what can be done so that there's something actionable. Executives generally want to support. Well, this is what it is. What can we do? And we're just going to wrap it up there. And thank you for everyone for participating and the questions that have come in. We've got. We just wanted to finish up with Marsh. We really have a well-resourced and expert natural catastrophe and climate risk team, and so we're there to help and guide you through this. We know it's difficult, we know it's complex, and we're all facing these risks. We're all facing a hard insurance market where availability of insurance and is difficult. The price of insurance we know is increasing quite significantly, and so traditional risk transfer may not always be the way. There's other forms of risk transfer. We're seeing an increased interest in deeper analytics, looking at how you retain more risk or use alternative risk transfer, such as parametric insurances that are more weather-based. So there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat and how you approach it. And definitely we all welcome, and I know I echo Sophie and Saskia and all those in our team that welcome the opportunity to just talk and get on a call with you and help you understand that and the types of ways we might be able to assist. And so we will be sending over this presentation to you that for everyone who registered. It will be live on our website too. There will also be a white paper that you can download covering today's insights, and that we'll send as a follow-up. And so thanks again. Hope you all have a great rest of your day and get prepared for this climate change and the weather events that are impacting us. And so we'll finish there. Thanks, everyone.